Good evening. If we refer back to the decree on architectural excesses of the 50s, major part of critique addressed to architects was dealing with decor, facades, columns, other expensive mosaic elements and murals and other exterior elements. But I think of all previous reports, it becomes clear that architectural revolution of 1955 referred to anything but the exteriors or decorations of the building. And this situation closely relates to the absolutely a new area for the late 50s and transferring from planners of the space or environment to planners of lifestyle, or coders of what was later in political project was labeled as private. So what is basically is under the attack of critique in these speeches and proclamations of 1950s and 60s? Well, the illustration shows that one of the most typical patterns of criticism was aimed not against exteriors but against badly designed internal space, because, well, basically pre-Stalin dwelling architecture was moving to the communal forms of living. Otherwise, when families were sharing the same apartment, if we look at the type project released in 1935, we see that architects at that period mostly appealed to the builders. And if we look at the number of publications of dwelling for the workers, also we see that it's focused on the main three parameters of internal arrangement of the apartment: built-in closets, lighted lavatories, and the kitchens with a cupboard, table, and under window cooler. What's happening in the 50s and 60s? We see a total change in perception of the layout of the apartment, where architects appeals not only to the builders but to the broad public, to the mass dwelling crowd. And here we see a picture from a book released by a big number of population. It already shows the filled-in internal space. It's not just entressols and kitchens. It's already filled and equipped with standard type of furniture items, flower vases and other items. So the cardinal deep shifts happening in the architect's profession and perceptions of the dwelling is also reflected in architectural semantics. Otherwise, in change of the concepts in the meanings of certain basic terms. Here's example from number of publications where the headlines are using the word of благоустройство or improvement. So you see that there is certain change in this concept. Instead of interpreting as a sanitarian or hygienic standards, it's broadening in terms of including also aesthetic elements. Well, the very concept of interior starts to emerge. Well, prior to 1994, in the catalogs of Russian libraries, you may find only 2 publications where the interior word is used in their headlines. Well, these were just instructions or manuals for drawing lessons. So later on in the 50s, well, the interior appears as a term in the architectural and public vocabulary, talking about trends typical of later 50s and up to middle 80s, both profession of architect and the very concept of apartment and typical dwelling goes through 3 radical changes. First of all, firstly, transition of an apartment as a place available for living of several apartment families, just as a place for one family. And since that time, well, the work starts focusing on, elements of zoning, insulation, otherwise the concepts and terms which slowly but surely will start separating, concepts of communal and personal, and the whole idea is turning into more functional and aesthetic. So it leads so that from the hands of private initiative, from the hands of dwellers, well, the architects catch up several ephemeral concepts, like, for example, design of furniture, and also lighting and other aspects. Otherwise, they start coding it, describe it, and then disseminate in popular brochures for massive, conscience of the dwellers. And finally, prior to massive planning, well, they were prevailed by social-demographic study of dwelling and living, standards and prototypes, which result not only in formulating how many rooms are needed for a standard dweller, they bring to certain anthropological typization of personal. And how was it expressed? Well, it was manifested or expressed that architects step into the area of ideological blah blah, which probably in the 30s they were trying to circumvent somehow. So in one of the discussion from 1968 was relevant to the fact of free time or spare time. And this spare time factor becomes impossible, necessary for, versatile development of a personality. So what is this versatile personality concept? Well, it was formulated in later years, existed to the end of the Soviet period. Well, versatile personality, it's an emancipated personality, well, within a Soviet concept of collective, so beyond the centric form of development, and is getting more intertwined with, concept appearing in the late 50s. Well, free time, requires demands in terms of taste, preferences, and of course it's a free labor released by technical and scientific progress. As a result of architectural thought and practice starts looking more closely to the concepts of comfort and free time and etc. Many publications of the 50s and 60s will replicate a new type of architectural labor. Finally, the architects really should be the one who is caring for, preserving this triad in organization of daily life of a Soviet citizen. In social democratic surveys, which on the one hand show the structure and size of Soviet families, which should be complying proportionally to the size of Soviet living standards, not only structural but also divided according to the social group definitions. For example, those who gave answers to the question how many rooms of apartment you'd like to have. And here's another example which more reminds of matrimonial kinship from the book by Levi-Strauss, and again it's a publication from one of such books which were used as one of the theoretical foundations for planning of apartments.
So it's not only about the square meters and split into different rooms, it's also about very densely populated dislocation of individuals in an apartment. For example, a gentleman with a pipe is taking 100 in terms of height, and the gentleman with the book 115. So now architect is taking care of the individuality, and it becomes a typical feature, and therefore they have to identify all the domestic practices. For example, in the right hand corner, you can see that the comforts can be measured by very precise figures up to 10 centimeters. Then architectural work with space is not just limited by norms and anthropological structures. They are going to use many other things, and I'm sure that the architects that are here today might correct me whether it's just a normative work which remains just inside the architectural institutes, or whether it is really used for planning the kitchen space. But look how it is implemented. For example, that I mean in the triad of leisure time and free time, because they're trying now to map the life of a lady, of a woman in the kitchen, and the average height of the table should be 85 centimeters for a lady with an average height. And there are other ephemeral variables such as light, air movement, light not only in a living room but also in the kitchen. And according to the publications appeared in the 60s and 70s, we can identify a whole list of parameters, and the architects believe that they are theirs, and so they codify those things, and they plan based on those indicators. For example, they have a built-in furniture, but also noise isolation, the color of the walls, the clocks, and flowers. And in one of the discussions in 1970, one of the architects is talking about clockification of the typical residential space. And this is another popular publication which is addressing citizens with instructions. And they give instructions how they should use the space planned by the architect, with all those ephemeral structures like typical furniture or curtains of a specific color that can help you change your life to the better. And we can see that there were quite many concepts that changed their meaning, and between the 50s and 60s, the concept of wallpaper that used to appear only in prices changed their meaning. So then the notion of repair or renovation. So they now tie it in with a space of transport and housing. So there were many publications with instructions how to do repair works in your house. And then there was the first book published for amateurs, how they can make this repair works themselves. So continuing this theme of codification of a personal space or family shows not only some exemplary models of toilets, but also some exemplary interiors. So let's take a look how many vases there are. There are 6. So can you imagine that this information is included in the architectural books, and these books are designed not only for professionals but also non-professionals. So that's how all these household items make their way back to those textbooks. For appear in the new paradigm, and the layout is now new because this is the flowers that are placed on the hanging shelves. So this brings us to the next point, when an army of decorators are working together to create highly artistic apartments. And as a result of this revolution, the apartment, both in architects' eyes and in consumers' eyes, as well as political leaders' eyes, becomes not just the space with walls and furniture. The main notion used in architecture, beginning with late 50s, is the concept of living environment. So this and it includes not only zoning, not only these obsessive elements like vase and flowers, but also a person is codified there, a new person of this period. And there are quite a few dimensions that are codified, such as sleeping, personal hygiene, and taking care of equipment and objects. And so the personal is understood as normative. It's codified in ergonomic and anthropocentric terms, and there's another work of the 70s, and it's transferring processes of family life into functional zones of an apartment. And this architectural work is about how you can group your family processes in the space of family life. And I underlined some zones or elements that are related to mutual use, and they're marked in red. So many architectural publications offer that you should plan your apartment not from the bathroom, but from the sleeping place. So then it will depend whether you sleep together or separately. Because codification of sexual life is not there. So they didn't reach that point then. And then the radios, we can see the strange combinations of radiola with some qualms and other elements. So it's an attempt to codify the space of an apartment as a space for one family and for the person. So there's another important aspect here about the transfer towards a Soviet private space. For example, if we take a look at the publications, we can see that it's enough to codify different elements of your life, personal life, including hygiene, nutrition, recreation, leisure, and, for example, politics and labor are not here. They disappeared from these elements. So all these elements that we can see here are related to more domestic household activities. So in the 70s, everybody is just busy with recreation and procreation, and speaking about politics, it will appear with the appearance of television and radio as consumption of political information. And continuing Boris's comments, I actually haven't seen this, so we can't really discover how they identify and codify spaces between apartments, not in terms of architectural forms and variables, but in terms of architectural practices relevant to family life. And at some point in the late 60s, the architectural attempt to work with this space was completed with complaints and indignation. So there was an attempt to introduce some architectural projects related to neighboring communicative spaces. But this is a stupid thing, because the most important principle of socialist construction is not about making sure everybody is equal. It's taking care about free time of workers. So then there's the criticism of bourgeois sociology, because they didn't set the question right that was so tempting for Soviet architects. And so Soviet architects shouldn't really deal with family life. So I guess you understand what I'm trying to say. The model of this consumer who is standardized and typified, which is not just the result of spontaneous self-development, but it's a result of programmed and codified reality. And so he becomes the owner of the space which cannot be communicated through collective space. And beginning with 1991, when there were when the privatization of the apartments became possible, at first people began to build iron doors at the entrance of their flats, then at the entrance to their sections of the buildings, and gradually they trying to privatize the courtyard, and the car becomes a continuation of home comfort, time saving, and other estimates and calculations that were envisioned by the architects in the 60s. So this concept of isolated and individual life of a family in its life is codified and ideologized, and so this brings us up to the fact that we are no longer interested in such issues as the case of Sentsova and Kolchenko, because we are just spending most of the time inside our cars. I would like to thank Alexander for this presentation, because he touched upon a very important issue, which is about destruction of local individual subject. You said that the principle of collectivization was initiated by Stalin, but this collectivism principle was very popular in the 20s during the debates about socialist city. It was before Stalin. So, and if we take a look at the records of those debates, then the principle of collectivism collectivism is not just limited with the space of your apartment or sometimes room, which is just 3 meters wide, and it's like a cabin for a person, and then the rest of the space should be collective space, space for interaction between people. So those ideas were really strong, and they started coming from the bottom, from the grassroots level, from workers that represent active part of population, maybe charged with leftist ideas. And the only opponent to this principle during those discussions was Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who was trying to remind everyone that there was, for example, procreation function, and people could have personal relations, some intimate relations, some intimate space. And as to Stalin's period, I can say that vice versa. It's like it's more like renormalization. Because they are using this diversity approach to housing. And this is just my small comment. And now my question: do you see any prospects for this recent initiative of the owners of the buildings? Maybe you know some successful practices. Do you think it might get anywhere, or is it doomed? Well, thank you for your comment. I didn't mean the slogan about collectivism during Stalin's time. I just meant different thing. Then speaking about the initiatives of the owners of the building, and the residents can work with the areas that are adjacent to their buildings. They are planting flowers, they are making paths. They are interesting initiatives, but they fit in the paradigm that was started in the late 50s, before beautification of this inter-apartment space, which is the continuation of the comfort zone of the family, was something, for example, that the citizens could plant some trees in that common areas, because local administrations often think that it could lead to crimes, but it helps to improve socialization, communication between people. But these attempts seem ephemeral, because all those owners of the apartments are thinking about their daily problems rather than more broad issues. So I guess they have to go through some time so that they exhausted those issues that they are facing now, and then so that they could set the questions how they could communicate with each other. I would like to thank you for this semantic analysis that you made between Stalin's and Khrushchev's flats and apartments. It was very interesting for me. And speaking about the sizes of flats and experiments with the sizes started in late 20s. Bruno Tota and other German specialists published their works, and Ginsburg's works were available as well. So this led those events. And I don't know if you know Ernst Neuffer. Maybe you have seen his book. And Neuffer can be characterized as a Vignola of the 20th century. He published the textbook which is called Bau and Vorsleva, and in 1936 it was published in Germany. I would say that there are more than 500,000 copies have been sold up to now. It was translated into 45 languages, including Russian. I think it was done in 1979, and this book was a table book for many architects. So Neuffer was a very interesting person. So he was a functionalist. He worked in the 20s. Then he became some problems with the Nazis, with the Nazi, and afterwards he became the main assistant of Albert Speer during the Second World War. So he developed the policies for Speer. And it would be interesting to see how he rationalized those sizes, anthropological sizes, and other elements. And it's obvious for me that many images that you showed were borrowed from Neuffer. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comment and for this proposal to study Neuffer. It's true that some examples of these architectural practices developed in the 30s and 40s. For example, some of the illustrations that I showed were taken from Olga Boyar's book about the decorations of the apartments. So she did a publication in 1945 that was called the equipment of apartments with inbuilt furniture in the US. And at that time in the Soviet Union, no mass production of furniture was available. And so it's very interesting to see all that, and to respond to your question would be to mention the aggregated character of those practices. So this was the dominating paradigm in architectural institutes, whereas in the 30s it wasn't there yet.